our first talk by UC San Diego person this year, and I think it's really fitting that it's David Kirsh. Many of you know David. In fact, many of you came just for David. We owe a special thanks to Vanessa Poole and Tina Eco, who scrambled to get us a bigger room when I realized that we were going to outstrip our normal spot, and so it's great to be here. Thank you to them. And I came across David's work many years before I moved down here, and I was first struck by David's work. He had a paper with his former student Paul Maglio where he studied how people's use of external representations facilitated their thought, and he looked at Tetris players, finding that people often explore in the world instead of in their minds in order to be better at games like Tetris. And I thought that that was a really profound insight. References to David's paper show up more often in my own work than almost anything else, and for many of you who have taken my classes, you're familiar with that work as well. And so David's ideas about embodiment had a huge thinking on how I thought about design. And I've been amazed how over the past decade or so since that work began, that he's taken in all sorts of new directions. And what he's going to talk with us about today is a really cool collaboration he's been doing with dancers and looking at the role of embodiment there. So please join me in welcoming David.
Thank you very much, Scott. So one of my objectives today is to prove to you that I can make you think faster. And it will take your concentration, but I believe by the end of it, you will agree that you have thought faster. This is an example of dancers marking. And marking is universal in dance. Everybody does it, but no one has studied it. I went to the library on dance in London, and there was no articles or books on marking. It involves practicing a movement with less energy than the full-out version, and no one ever performs like this. It's an imperfect model of a more complete movement. Dancers insist that marking helps them think about their movement, and we have experimental proof to show that they're right. It's an instance of a general nonverbal interactive way people have of thinking, which is what I'm going to be talking about. So the story I'll tell is really concerns the varieties of ways in which the different modalities are all harnessed. Our eyes, our hands, our eye-hand, our bodies, external representations, tools and objects, all of those things, these many modalities, these many media, are all harnessed in order to facilitate thought. And the way that goes on is we can start thinking of it as these different kinds of mediated cognitions. So if you think of cognition as something that's going on in your head, it's mediated often, at least at a conscious level, by little auditory icons. They're auditory images you have when you're talking to yourself. You could have visual images, and the relation between the visual image that you feel you're in control of and the thinking process, which you are unaware of, is ill-defined and ill-understood. Now, if you think that there's interaction happening between these mediated things, these things inside you, well, Vygotsky said those things are internally derived from external things. So why not would it be the case that thinking originally was by doing these things outside? Now, sometimes what you get when you internalize this is the procedures for working on the outside, which you then internalize on the little simulacra, the little things that are models of the outside things. But there's a lot of variety and a lot of different things that happen. So what I'm going to talk about as soon as I come back alive is I'm going to try to make the case to you that thinking, there's a lot of multitasking going on because there are like only 75 of these things happening.
I think you proved your thesis.
I don't think. Okay. Let's hope that there were not too many things saved that didn't get saved. All right. We're going to proceed. So I ask you, people don't ask this question. What pushes thought forward? Why does it move? Where does that come from? Now we get some of this out here, where people are dragging their eyes along in reading. It's called a pacer, to use your hand like that. And that has been shown marginally to improve people's speed reading. In fact, it's not a reliable thing to improve people's speed reading, but it does improve it a little bit, and for some people it improves it a fair bit. As with many of these things, what you find is that it's unevenly distributed. So many times things work for some and not for others. Let's look a little more closely at how eyes help us think. Will this design work? Now you look at it. What exactly are you doing when you do that? You try to note how you're probing the image. What parts are you looking at? Are you creating some kind of partial narrative of use, running through, using it this way or that way? This is a kind of active vision, an enhanced kind of vision. Which little square will be folded onto the top? So you do some kind of folding process. Not perception, not the same as imagination, because you're looking at it. Imagination has no size. If you have a mental image, it has no particular size. This is kind of augmented vision. You're projecting it onto the outside. You have constraints under which you're operating. So I will argue, and I think that you're primed to appreciate, that much thinking involves construction, modeling, or simulation. And this talk is basically a riff on that basic idea. That as creatures who know the world through sensing and acting and experiencing consequences, we make sense of things by recreating possible situations and probing them. We create perceptual narratives. And we think by doing. We have many flexible ways of actually changing the situation to help the narrative construction. And this is not hypothetical deductive reasoning, because we are probing to change expectations, to move thought forward, to discover more than to confirm. Hypothetical deductive is for confirmation. It's not for discovery. There's projection. Here's another kind of visual thinking, but it's not the same as some other kinds of visual thinking. So I say, move 11 to where 15 is. In the game of 8. Everybody knows this, I'm sure. And what you do is you project those little faint images to kind of confirm that to yourself. So we have active vision, which is probing the outside in a very inquisitional, active way. We have visual strategies. We have projection, which is going on top of that. And now, if I say move 11 to where 1 is, can you do that? How many moves can you actually project into the future? It's tough. It's going to be more than you can. So when that happens, we have the projection, we go a little distance, and then we change it in the outside world so that we can push further. So we have this process, this interactive process of you look, you project, then you create. You create when you have to. You don't create unless you have to. And to solve harder versions, that's what we do, manipulate the outside. So the thesis is then, thinking often involves making models or simulations through active perception, projection, and manipulation. Now, what I'm going to talk about has the following structure. First, I'm going to review the main theoretical claims, which I have introduced already. So you are primed. You should be able to get them faster. Then I'll talk about thinking through the body, this study we did on dance making. Then thinking through instruments or tools, using various sorts of examples. And then doing a little bit on ordinary objects, but particularly representations. OK, so first claim. Thinking is often interactive. Hands. I say, prove all 3 medians of a triangle always intersect at a single point. Half of you now are trying to remember whether a median exactly what the definition of a median is. Can you do it just in your head? Do the medians intersect at a single point? So here's what happens. You say, OK, triangle, medians. I think it's this one as opposed to the splitting the angle up top. Intersect. I can get 2. Now the third one. Does it make it? Will it go through? So it's easier at this point to reach out and take your pencil. So I go like that. Then I say, OK, I can project, but it's so hard to project it. Even after I put the triangle out there, some people can do 3, but usually they can do 2. So then they have to write the 2 down, and then they put the third one down to check to see if that is the median in fact. So here we have a case where we can measure how far people can reliably project when they have to then create. So project structure, create structure. Usually before you create structure, you have a little evanescent, a weak little projection in advance. Projection can be in any modality. So normally, and so far, we've been talking about projection as a visual modality. I say shape this with your hands, this, right? I want you to get the tactile nature and the size of it. I want you to get the size. Now, without moving your hands, shape it. How would you get the dimensions right? So you're looking at that, and you're trying to get the dimensions right. Again, it's projection, because it's not just imagination. You are trying to coordinate your hands with the thing you're seeing. So we're anchoring it on the visually perceived object. So we have this interaction between kinesthetic projection, feeling it, and a visual perception. I say this in your head. She self, OK? What are you doing now? Auditory projection onto the visual thing of the words. Projection again. Very universal, not studied. Claim 3. External creation can also be in any modality. Here's a really disappointing because I have music. OK, here's a boy who is a world-class abacus user. He's multiplying 2 7-digit numbers in his head. He multiplies so fast with the abacus, he can't say the numbers that fast. So it's assumed that he encodes the numbers in abacus positions, which are faster to imagine than mental vocalization of numbers like 7, 5, 6, 9. So either as 7,000, such and such, or as separate numbers. So he creates this external process to model moving the abacus pieces, and this hand movement pulls his mental images along. He relies on mind-hand coordination. So he encodes the numbers in the visual thing. In order to give the visual thing adequate motion, he can move faster like the pacer by using his hands on that. Here we have, oh, the sound is so nice. I will be talking at length about this soon, but these dancers often mark, and what they are doing when they're marking, I'm going to argue, is making simple models.
You can put your lav mic to your laptop.
No sound is coming out of the machine. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The music is interesting. Scott mentioned Tetris. It was almost 20 years ago. And the question here that the person is going when the pieces are coming down, tink, 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 is where should that piece go? What we found was that people could physically rotate the piece faster than they can mentally rotate a piece. So you can physically rotate a piece at least 110 milliseconds, but some people as fast as 80 milliseconds. Mental rotation is 200 to 450 milliseconds. So you can go faster, but for that physical rotation to work, it has to be exactly coordinated temporally. So it has to be in temporal sync. We didn't emphasize that in that paper then. That's what I've been thinking about it since then, is how important the temporal coordination is between doing it outside and doing it inside, because you're not interested in this problem a few tinks later. You've already got it. The other thing is that physical rotation reveals different shapes. Now, of course, topologically and geometrically, it's the same shape. But in fact, it's a different shape with respect to how it behaves on the board. So we project the location, and that's how we solve that problem too. That was done with Paul Maglio. So far I've been saying we think interactively through projection and creation. Thinking often involves building models or simulations, and it helps us make sense of things and helps us think things through. And the interactive strategy is multimodal. Could be with gestures plus mental imagery, where I'm making that cube, right? So you just projected onto my hands right there. Body movement in the marking, which I'll go into in a second. We manipulate objects, and we can see all sorts of things through that. Writing, we do mental imagery on top of writing. Drawing is a big whole study, how we use drawing to facilitate thought, either both through visual imagery, visual thinking, and a whole lot more. Next claim. The interactive thinking requires a tight temporal coupling between internal and external processes. I was just talking about this. It's only useful for a tiny moment there. And now look at this wonderful dancer, Noah Gelber. So how people create a lot of modern dance is by working with visualizations. In this case, they would have done an exercise, and they would have taken, it's clear he's taken banquet hall furniture as the topic, the inspiration for solving a task. They would have given a task, take these kinds of furniture, anything you see out here, and make a dance out of it. And so as a practiced person, he would take that, and he's allowed to stretch them, collapse them, shrink them, tear them apart, do anything he wants, but he is engaged in the mental imagery. The mental imaging then is, he's going to operate through around something. He sees that. Well, is it kinesthetic? Is it visual? It's hard to say exactly what the imagery is that he is projecting and how that works. That's an open question. Claim 5. When we externally model, we mentally project to some aspect or dimension of the target thing. This is a harder thing to claim. It's a more interesting one as well. So what I mean is, often the projection will be like a caricature, or you'll be focusing on some part of it. So for instance, what Gelber was doing was he was taking the banquet table and closing it. He was focusing on the physical dynamics of the table, but he wasn't concerning himself with the momentum. Wasn't concerning himself with the inertia of that table that was related. So he could have, and that could have factored into his design of his movement, as it could be when I pick this up. I could concern myself with the speed, or I could concern myself with the shape, or I could concern myself with the feeling, the texture of it. Any of those aspects seem to be what people look at. And arguably, thought is always aspectival. It's a big claim, but OK, so I've done the main theoretical claims so far, and now I want to go more detailed into how we use our bodies to help us think. So this was the study, and now we're going to be looking at body-mediated cognition. So Wayne McGregor, the choreographer I've been working with for 6 years, came to UCSD 5 years ago or 6 years ago, 5 years ago, in order to make a new dance. And I made a class. We went out to 25 to 30 students would come out. They'd be in teams of 3. Each one would be devoted to a dancer. They would be there the whole day, spelling off each other. And they were taking notes. They would do an ethnographic study. And at the end of the day, they would interview. So I studied this. We took lots of video. And this was the only time he ever didn't complete the dance-making process. Here it takes about 6 weeks for one of these dances. And he completed it in London. He is the choreographer of the Royal Ballet, but he has a contemporary company called Random Dance. And it's on Random that I do the studies. So I went to London then to do FAR. It takes, again, about 6 weeks. And then the next year, he did Undance, another one. And then most recently, he did Atomos. And when we did the study here, it was really irritating because they changed venues, and you have to set up. It takes a long time to set up. So first, they were in Mandeville, and then they came to Cal IT. And Ramesh was very helpful in that, by the way. Thank you, even though these many years later. They did it in the cube. It was great. The students would be off to the side. I see some of you here. I saw a second ago. And they would take field notes in Excel. We had code. We learned the code beforehand. I interviewed Wayne morning and night. He normally gives one interview of 45 minutes to, say, Time magazine or something. He gave me 22 interviews over an hour each for the most part. So that was very special. We got to know each other. The students, we would scramble to get the questions that were very specific to that day. And then we wanted the students to have the dancers dance their answers, because the questions are about choreographic decisions that dancers are making. So if they are going to decide how to work on this chair, and they've been practicing one way or thinking of solving the problem one way, and then they decide to do something else, you would like them to dance and explain the solution that they came up with as to why it was better than the previous solution they had before. So I have a lot of hard drives, and we were collecting 20 terabytes for each capture, as well as all these other things. It's a pretty massive effort. One of the things that came out of that was that when you look at dance on the field with the eyes of a cognitive scientist, you can see that this activity of choreographic dance making is dripping with cognitive phenomena of interest. And one of them you take for granted, but then you say, what are they doing? Why are they doing that? You know that they're practicing, but then you ask, well, wait, why? Can that possibly facilitate? So here is an example of dance making in practice. All right, this is one of the videos that did not, it got lost in the crash. You would see that he is going like this. And you can see sometimes his eyes are closed, sometimes they're open. You can see clearly this person is thinking, and you say, how can that constitute a helpful method of practicing? So if you ask what is marking, in Irish river dancing, where they dance like this and they keep their arms stationary, they practice with their fingers. Wrong. Limbs. How can practicing like this possibly facilitate the much more massive control? So you all say, oh, hierarchical motor control. Yes. And then you'll say, oh, the brain is a great switching system. Yes. But still, although the term marking came from the phrase marking in time, and it's quite clear how people can mark in time like this, they get more than just temporal structure from the practice of marking. So marking is an imperfect model. This is not a good model of the other thing. It's like a phrase, or it's a sketch, or an abstraction of some sort. They seem to be attending to specific aspects of the movement. Perhaps this is only good for temporal structure or the sequence of motions, perhaps. And dancers do this all the time. It's a universal phenomena. Tennis swing, cellists do it in the wings. Stage plays, it's called doing the Italian run-through, or doing it in Italian, where they run through the stage, taking their position on the stage, doing it about a quarter of the time, going bit. It's not about the words, it's about the positioning. And we find this throughout. So here you see tennis teachers having their students practice things without a racket. People going like this before they do their scaling. And now you can't hear him. And he's saying, well, cello playing has so many things to look at. There is the shape of the phrase, the mood, the color, the bow speeds, the vibrato. All of these are the things that go into making the shape and color of a phrase. So he's pulling out those things as a teacher to have his students practice on these different aspects. The analogy would be that here's the real phrase the marked phrase is going after the key things. You can do smaller marking. You can do a stylized marking. And you can do a tiny stylized marking too. And all of these work. So here we have, I hope it's here. OK. Well, I will later show you these. They're really wonderful to see. These are the cases of full marking, where he danced full out, like that. Then we have Antoine doing about the same amount of time, but he does it large marking, where instead of going like this, like that, with full dynamics, so the full thing like that, the marked thing might be, the full marking might be like that, or even like that. And then there is small marking, which you really have to see to believe. And small marking might be, or he might even go like this, because he doesn't want to move his legs across. So small marking can really be that small. Now, how can that possibly be a form of practice or facilitation? Now, we would have another one, Agnes. OK, she's explaining what she's doing. I'm doing a pas de chat, and that would be like that. And now, when I want to mark it, I will just go like this. Now, she's doing full marking. There's no dynamics. I'm not using energy, but I'm thinking, what is my pathway? She's Spanish. And here she's doing large, and now she's doing small marking, and she said, oh, and I'll just do it like that. So sometimes, and she's ballet trained, they use conventionalized forms, pirouette, for various sorts of conventionalized. And the teacher will be up in the front going like this, and the dancers are going to do this as many times as the teacher rotates, or for as long, whichever they're going to do. So we wanted to explore experimentally whether marking really is of any value, or whether it's just something they do. Now, dancers have to mark. These dancers, they are doing Pilates or yoga or heavy kind of fun dance for 2 hours in the morning to warm up. They quickly run out and have a smoke and a filthy hamburger, and then the choreographer comes, and then they are going to dance for 5 hours more. And it's very hard work. Nobody can do 7 hours of that level of physical exertion. So part of the time, they're going to be doing this other kind of marking, this other kind of practice. And you wonder, well, are they just filling in time, or are they really learning something? So in order to test whether the conjecture was that marking is better than lying on the ground, simulating it in their head, which we know from previous experimentation is a way of improving. So people can learn to ski a little better by simulating it in their head, especially if they watch it and then practice what they see. And so we conjectured that marking would be a little better than mental simulation. But obviously, the thing that's really going on is the mental simulation when they're marking. So we hoped that there would be some facilitation. And full out would naturally be best. And we didn't know by how much it would be best. And so that was the hypothesis. The way we did it was we took 3 equally hard movements, about a minute long, and they were taught in 10 minutes. So these are super expert dancers. These are 800 highly professional dancers who've been in the best companies around the world who tried out for 800 tried out for 10 positions. So they're really super expert. They can learn a minute, which would take you 2 days or 3 days. They can learn that in 10 minutes. And then then we measured them using a number of dimensions, how well they performed. They would go off and practice for 10 minutes, and then we would measure the delta. Did they learn? How much did they learn? The practices, we broke them up into 3 categories. They would do, if one group did full out, the other marked it. The third group would lie on the floor and doing it. If they did full out, then they would mark it. The other group would do lying on the floor. They would do full out. So we broke it into what's called a Latin square. So they could be measured between themselves on approximately equally complex things to learn, phrases to learn. And we measured them on 4 criteria. One is called the technicality. That is the precision of the movements, pathways, locations. Memory would be the completeness. Did they get all the little pieces that were there that belonged? The dynamics, which marking doesn't do, would be the speed and the force of the movement. And the timing would be where is the step occurring, and assuming they got the right step, and so on. And the duration. The results, to our huge surprise, and everybody I spoke with, was that, in fact, marking outperformed full out. And they didn't learn anything from simulation. In fact, they were slightly negative. They lost something in simulation. The results measured by dimensions. On memory, we have, they were significantly better on memory. They were significantly better on technicality. Timing, close to a wash. A little better. Dynamics, they were not bad. They improved, but they were not, of course, as good as full out. But when you take it all together, it's hugely significant that marking was better than full out. So, what do we make of this? First thing to do is to generalize this and say, well, marking's a kind of movement reduction system. In that way, it's like whispering or subvocalization, things you do inside. It's like gesturing. It's like physical miming with objects. Physical miming. And so we might think that other movement reduction systems, which have a lower cost structure, would therefore be beneficial to use for various sorts of thinking things through. How does it work? Well, by now you can guess the general structure of this. They're going to project onto the physical movement. So the physical movement will have this, but the mental projection, either the kinesthetic projection or the visual projection. So think back to Noah Gelber, what he was doing with the tables. Either it's going to be the feeling of it, or it's going to be the vision of it, projected onto that little external scaffold. So what do we know about projection? We wanted to explore that idea of what is projection. In order to do that, we made a little experiment. And the experiment was to play tic-tac-toe under a few conditions. So we're going to distinguish perception, which is reality-oriented. You see what's out there, from projection, which is augmenting the reality onto a grid from a blank piece of paper or a blindfold, which is pure imagination. So the pure imagination has no size or location particularly. The projection case is anchored in these physical structures, what Ed Hutchins called material anchors. And the outside, seeing what's out there, is actual perception. And we wanted to claim, or wanted to explore the claim, that mental projection is more powerful than mental imagery alone. We can project beyond what we can easily imagine. And the result, the reason is that the external helps. So here's the imagination condition. No external structure to help projection. Many people did close their eyes, so we tried to minimize the chance for projection. The projection condition 2, this is because I was relatively stupid, and thought somehow that people were actually going to project X's and O's, which of course they don't. And this is just a distractor, as you would think it would be when you more clearly think about the question. Because how's it helping you by it sitting up there? That you needed that in order to have the little X in your head go onto it? You can do whatever you want for the X in your head. So the tic-tac-toe experiment went like this. We trained them on calling out numbers for the different cells. And then, once they practiced on that, we'd play tic-tac-toe with them. And if I called out 1, you'd call out 5, I might call out 9. And that's how we would determine what their move was without involving them seeing anything visual. You can't say that this is what people like to say about the outside, that, oh, well, the outside is an opportunity to just do memory offload. because the board is the same all the time. So you can't say I'm literally offloading memory into external structure as if it would be by queuing something by keeping it out there, because I haven't moved anything. So it's all going on in my head. So it can't be offloading. And what we found was, in the 3x3 case, there was nothing. We didn't get anything. Now, so having this grid or this table was no faster, no fewer errors than having the blank page. And in fact, many people complained about it. So some people were significantly better on the blank page. They found the external stuff to be a distractor. There were some people who were significantly better. But in any experiment, there are going to be different pockets of people. You can't do that. So why would that be? Well, so maybe there are costs for anchoring. You actually have to put the thing out there. If it's easy enough for you to imagine it, why would you bother to go through the effort of putting it out there? And the better you are on visual imagery, probably the cost isn't worth it. So do the benefits ever overcome? Well, first I might say we did give everyone a vividness of visual imagery test. And we did find that those who are the better visualizers do better without the external structure. But we said, well, look, this task of tic-tac-toe is so simple, even the bad visualizers seem to be good enough at it. So we increased the board to a 4x4. You've got to get 4 in a row here. Same thing, 3 conditions. And now we did, in fact, find that the mean time per move was better for the faster for the case where we had the grid. This is the grid with the X and O. So you can see now they're starting to separate out over here. It's a distractor. So that once you come to a harder task, the cost of coordination is being paid for by the benefits. When we looked at the visualizers, we found that weak visualizers were helped much more than strong visualizers, who nonetheless were significantly better. But the weak visualizers were, well, they're almost significantly better. I'm sorry. But the weak visualizers were much improved, making the mean significantly different. And we did this on a small set of subjects, I don't know, 15 or 12. And if we had done that, I'm confident, on 30 or 50, we would find that even among the strong visualizers, that would turn out to be a significant difference. So there it's a trend. So I would argue that projection is a real process. It's distinct from perception and imagination. As problems get harder, we can't easily imagine the answer as well as in the 4x4 case. So we rely on creating external structures to project onto. That would be the grid. And that serves as a scaffold. And therefore, that's a lot of what we're doing all the time, is creating external structure. Our job as designers is to figure out how to design the right external structures to facilitate whatever kind of cognitive process we're interested in. That's the challenge. Now, my next claim is that if we can think with our bodies, which I've been arguing from the case of dancers thinking with their marking, we can also think with things that we're highly practiced with. So if you think there's some interaction going on between the body is actually performing a computation or some service for you, just like the Tetris piece outside. The Tetris piece, when it twirls, is not performing a digital computation. You could conceive it as a digital computation, but it's better to conceive of it as an analog computation. It's certainly an analog process. So what we have is a coordination between the central nervous system and an analog process, whatever we conceive of as the internal CNS activity. In the case of the body, the actual elasticity of the body is going to do stuff for us. So there's going to be physical computation performed by the body. The CNS is one thing. The body is a second thing. We don't normally call it interacting with our body. We call it, we seem that we go right through our body and we interact with the stuff outside. But it is an interaction with our body. And now, if you can do it with your body, why not do it with stuff outside? So here's the quick little thing now. So I've argued that we can use our eyes, we can use our hands, we can use our bodies. I now want to argue that we can use tools to help us think. So here we have Yitzhak Perlman. And when he has got his violin in his hands, surely that is a kind of instrument-mediated cognition. We see it in all sorts of things where people are working with things. What we want to understand is, how does working with the physical media constitute a form of extended thinking? So you're in a coordinated relation with the outside stuff. You're in partnership. Sometimes you're doing it inside. Sometimes it's doing it for you. And it's dragging you to the next state. So that's the idea. The physical properties of the interaction drag thought along with it in a helpful manner. This guy, you all recognize, surely thinks with his tennis racket. Shoveling snow, you certainly think with your shovel. And when you look at mental representations as they are, as body representations, as they are computed in the central nervous system, a distinction is drawn between the cortical representation or the mental representation of peri-hand space, peri-head space, and peripersonal space. So an experiment was done. This monkey has normal peri-hand space, was trained for 3 weeks, 3 weeks, using a shovel. And the question was, did it alter its internal representation of the edge of its boundary? The body's boundary is a very important thing because we don't judge distance very well. But we judge distance quite well when we can go into peripersonal space. So the peripersonal representation of this spot, this distance from me, is a way in which my visual system learns the distance. So the coding of that distance is going to be by that distance. This is my understanding of that distance. How far is it? That far. Gibson talked about it being this far, by the speed. You increase the speed, you know the distance. This case, so there are clear and explicit representations of various things. And what was found was that the peripersonal space, which is extended by the rake, was encoded differently. So tool use alters the body schema. What's modified is the somatosensory representation of the body shape, our estimate of distance. Just touchable by the rake, bow, tennis racket, rapier, those judgments of distance are all different, and they're mediated by the tools that you get used to. And it doesn't take long for you to calibrate to extra length. That's how long it took for me to learn that distance. And there was a change in my peripersonal, my peri-hand space length with that. That's how long it took. So now, you can ask, well, OK, so this guy, he has absorbed the violin into him as a tool. And music is an interesting thing because you cannot make these things, these external things, without the help of the swingle singers aside. You cannot make these sounds without the help of instruments. So he's creating some kind of structure in the world by the tool, and he practices all the time. So surely an expert like this thinks with his body. Thinks with the instrument. And you can now ask, can they have the same thoughts without the instrument? Some people will say, sure. An expert can have the same thought without playing. And why is that? Oh, you should hear this. You really want to move when you see this, because performance is very physical. And in the 20th century, 21st century, performance is more physical than ever before than in history. And you hear this. To hear this is to feel you're playing it, because it's so evocative. This guy, who's played this many times, when he hears that, or when he sees it, his mirror neurons should be going nuts. Right? So why would he have to play it? Why wouldn't, if he plays it enough, surely he can simulate playing without having the instrument. Internalization. If I learn the language well enough, surely I can have the words, the sound of the words in my head without having to say them out loud. So it ought to be the case that instrument-mediated cognition is possible without the instrument. He's so good in his auditory scene perception, that when he listens, it ought to feel as if he's playing. And there's plenty of support for this. It's called, depending upon your favorite phrase, motor resonance, mirror neuron, action observation. Those are all cases. And the belief is that, the claim is that watching or listening stimulates covert actions as if you were dancing or playing. So the theory of mirror neurons is that an action really consists of two parts. There's the covert performance of the action, which is the motor preparation, all that goes into readying the schema for unleashing the body. And then there is the overt part, which is allowing the execution of the covert part. And the mirror neuron system, or the motor resonance system, suggests that vision alone can activate the covert part. And you just don't exercise the last part. So that experts should be able to simulate playing. And we have some support of this, because in active perception, which I think I won't explain to you, it sort of relies on that same conception that when we see something, we are activating underlying dispositions to possible ways of interacting with it. So my perception of this pen would include all of my ways of potentially interacting with it. I have a probability distribution of all the ways I might interact with it. And if I were to do that, I would see it like this. And if I were to go like that, I would see it like that. And all of the collection of different percepts I would have under particular actions, that family is what I activate, the underlying probability distribution over those counterfactuals. If I were to do this, this is what I would see. That is what perception is. So auditory perception, they ought to be enacting a possible future, because that's, so to feel the violin like that is to know what it would be like to have the string bend, to feel it like that. Yet, what's the resolution of mirror neurons? In all good studies, you find that the resolution is not so good. It's an empirical question, but listening is not performance because of the physicality. The performer is the one who has the responsibility to succeed. The observer does not. So in studies of performance, and performance is a big field that people now study, there's a lot about the performer situation. That changes things if you are the performer. You got responsibility. They have to decide how to attack the note, its mood, its emotionality, in a way which, as listening, though you may anticipate, I wonder if they're going to do it this way or that way, you don't have the same feeling about that decision. And all of these concepts of being in the moment, the physicality of it, all of those are extremely in the moment, situated, and they're embodied in the performance. And they're not available to the expert observer. So one would claim, you have to do experiments to prove this, or you have to do neural studies, that expert agents project a future that's the ones who are actually performing, that's conceptually and experientially richer than the future projected by an observer. simulation is a lower resolution than actual playing. So with a violin in hand, the musical engagement is in fact mediated differently than in imagination or active listening or projection. This has been long. I'm not going to show you how it works with external objects and external representations, or objects nearby, how you would think with gears. And I'll just move to the conclusion. So what I'd like you to appreciate from this talk is that thinking, which so often, because of the philosophical and computational tradition, has been treated as a propositionally oriented activity. We have no better account of what a thought is than the thing that is expressed in language, because language is so magnificently precise. But no one wants to give up the idea that there's visual reasoning, and I want to encourage you to think that there's auditory reasoning and kinesthetic reasoning and other kinds of reasoning, tactile reasoning. So I want to emphasize that thinking can be a multimodal process. Sometimes it's highly perceptual, where you build visual narratives, and the thinking is in the way you build those visual narratives, the way you inquisition the outside world. Or it could be kinesthetic probing. It usually involves some kind of projection when it's concerned with the outside world. The inside and outside processes have to be tightly coupled. It often involves a mental simulation or a construction that's coupled to the outside. And because simulation and projection are hard, interacting is also usually part of the thinking process. So we don't just have that stuff out there and we have this stuff in here. We often have the interaction, that actual movement as part of the thinking process. What we have are eye-hand-mediated cognition, body-mediated cognition, tool-mediated cognition, external representation-mediated cognition, and object-mediated cognition, which I didn't talk so much about. And when we have the right structures and movements, we can push thought forward faster. I showed you a lot of slides. Maybe you didn't realize that. So I have a lot of people to thank. There were the classes, among which there have been several, in fact, at least one or two every year since we first started. They work on ethnography on it. They learn how to do that. And as a result, I get some data and some coding, and a variety of people who work there, including Random Dance. Thank you.
Is projection one quality, or can it be broken up into different things? So to put as a question, if someone's good at playing tic-tac-toe by projecting it in his mind, will that person also be good at playing games like chess and other things which involve a large amount of projection as well? Or will they require different projection skills?
Experiment, it's an empirical question, of course. So there is a test called VIVIC, Vividness of Visual Imagery Quotient. And before they made VIVIC, people doing work on imagery were trying to do the imagery process across all modalities. For some reason, that was done at the turn of last century, early part of last century. The other bits dropped out. So first I'm going to discuss your question, which is how uniform is the capacity to project, by asking, if you're good at projecting visually, are you good in projecting through the other modalities? To which my strong belief is they're different according to modalities. What it would be to project or to have pure visual imagery in a different, pure imagery in a different modality I ask you to pretend that you're lying down over here. So we were going to build, I started to build a quotient for kinesthetic imagery. And I ask you to pretend you're lying down here with your knees up against the wall. Now imagine yourself pushing yourself and pushing yourself away from the wall. That process by which you imagine yourself pushing and onto the floor, dragging along the floor, that would be kinesthetic. Don't do it visually, do it kinesthetically, pushing yourself away. Okay, so that would be kinesthetic imagery. That's going to be different than people. With respect to visual imagery, you see huge differences. It's curious, though, that if you were a Tibetan monk, to learn the primary Tibetan meditation, you are required to work with some of the ferocious deities and the nice deities, and you're supposed to see those mentally see those in 3 dimensions and in animation as they act out a narrative. That takes about 3 months of practice. So you can start where I say, okay, everybody, imagine a candle wavering on my hand right now. I have this would be, don't bother to project it there. Just think of what it would be like to see a candle wavering under the wind. Some of you, the distribution here would really surprise you. Some people will actually see that flame almost as vividly as they see it in real life. And other people know there's a flame there, and they know it's behaving in a certain way. They don't actually see it. They almost see it, but they don't see really it. And it doesn't behave visually, but they are controlling it. So the capacity to imagine is not the same as the capacity to create images. But we can ask the vividness of the image. You say chess versus tic-tac-toe. If you're a highly practiced chess player, of course your capacity to see images, project moves onto the board will be better than an unpracticed, just like the Tibetan. But you still could be asking the general question about your imagery capacity and that your projection capacity. It's a good empirical question which requires a good empirical study, and what we'd love to see is some neuroscientists get on board and start to go at this thing, because it is exactly at that level that it could be studied from a neuroscience point of view. So it's a great question. No real answer other than this little words these stories, just so stories I've been telling. Yeah, Bill.
So I was really struck by the results from your dance study, that the marking was actually superior to the full performance. And I was wondering if you had ideas about why it was actually superior instead of just, falling in the middle as you expected.
Yes, I have a lot of beliefs about that, but they are just beliefs, and it represents an area that I'm really keen to do further study on, and it involves what I'll call a theory of aspect. So when you do full out, you're required to do all the parts of the movement. Now, first off, we did find that when people were marking, they practiced in smaller chunks. So if you added up all the parts that they practiced a lot more bits than the people who did full out. We don't think it's attributable just to the fact that they practiced more in some sense, though that could be the reason. It's more likely that they could fixate on the parts that were hard for them. So take a musical instrument, or violin, which is my favorite. So in violin, there's bowing technique, and there's fingering technique, and then there's a lot more that goes into it. Different types of bowing. So in a given piece, someone may just practice the bowing, not worry about the fingering. But if you're practicing full out, you're performing to yourself or to your teacher, you're practicing both the fingers and the bow. So it's advantageous to extract aspects out, to fixate on, and then you later have to pay the price of putting the aspects together. Suppose they are linearly separable. Okay, then in principle I should be able to lay them all over without any interaction between them, but in all likelihood they are not linearly separable, so I can abstract out this piece, work on it, but then when I put it with the other one, I have to negotiate the last little bit. So we have to find some amount of full-out practice. I don't think you can take it far enough in just marking, but it's a more efficient form of practice because it's directed at where the problems are more precisely. That would be the theory, and it requires, and shocking as this might seem, just like there's no work on marking, there is next to no work, if not no work, on a theory of practicing. Of course, violinists have certain ways in which they teach their students how they want them to practice, but there seems very little academic work on practicing like this, like a musical instrument. Yeah?
So I was also curious about practice effects versus what you might call interference effects in projection. You know this poem After Apple Picking by Robert Frost? He goes out and picks apples all day, and then as he's going to sleep, he sees all these apples.
Yeah.
I've noticed that with fireworks. Like I can sort of shut my eyes and imagine fireworks to some extent, but if I see a fireworks show for a couple hours, I'm really able to visualize them and control them and so forth. But then by the next day, it's kind of
Right.
gone. It seems like there could be some sort of a short-term, I don't know what you want to call
Priming.
it, effect there.
So priming would explain why it is that you would have, it would be more easy to activate things that you had just seen. And the example of priming that is, to me, always a further indication of how pathetic humans are, is that if I say an infrequent word, like vestibular, the probability that you now will use the word vestibular in the next week has gone way up. Vestibular. And it's likely the case that even in the next few days, you might say the word vestibular for no good reason. So priming lasts a long time, and it degrades, but it lasts a long time. And that would explain why it's a lot easier to reactivate those things. The more general question you were asking, I think, was related to expertise. So I only played one game ever once a lot, and that was Tetris. But it was honestly just for the science. And that's true. But I had to become at least as good as a bad expert. And what I found from playing Tetris was that I was seeing Tetris pieces twirling whenever I looked at bricks, whenever I looked at anything outside that had angles on it, I was seeing those pieces. Now that's a practice effect. And sure, coming back to the question about projection, some things will be more easy to project if they are recently primed, or prolonged prime, because if you're playing it all the time, you're just in a constantly primed state. But again, empirical question, worth exploring. Yeah, hi.
So I'm actually really interested in the head simulation, right? Because I'm just questioning as to whether or not there is ever a pure example of in the head simulation. Because I mean, even if you got a dancer laying down and imagining their moves, I can almost picture them going.
Yeah.
Moving their neck, moving their eyes, maybe moving their fingers, even in a minute bit. And even that would be marking in a sense, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be.
But in a very, very
Yes, could be. So, well, what about dreaming, where your body is, you secrete the equivalent of curare to make your body immobile. So there's a case where we could make somebody immobile and see if they were able to be facilitated by mental simulation. It's an empirical question, right? Yeah.
And we will take further questions from here in the vestibule.